Moving on to the next topic under heritage craft is the colonial rule and crafts in India. Now, during the 17th century, as we saw in the last class, there was the concept of Shreni, which were the trade guilds. There was a concept of Jajmani, which was exchange of goods and services for the craftsmen that existed. Now, the demand for everyday utility craft was on its peak up till the second half of century. However, this brought in a worldwide reputation for India, talking about the status and the content that were there. Tavernier, who was a French traveler during the Mughal period, had talked about how the Shah of Persia actually presented him with a coconut shell which had sets of jewelry, a muslin turban which was so soft that it could even not be felt even by touch, that you have worn something. So that was a kind of depiction that was given during the colonial period by the French travelers in India. Now at that time, India had a strong trade relationship with neighboring nations. For example, Greece, Rome, China. We had the Silk Route, which was running from China to Europe. There were numerous archaeological excavations that talk about it. Sea route was built for Mediterranean countries, and there was trade with Southeast Asia. India's coastline had numerous shipbuilding centers, and Mauryan Empire during this time had numerous craftsmen who were able to sustain and develop buildings, build monasteries, Buddhist structures and sculptures were built. Even when we talked about textile, some of our best textiles was exported. For example, in the regions of Southeast Asia, we exported sarong. To the Middle East, muslin cloth. In the West Africa, Christian altar fronts were exported. To Europe, silk and woolen fabrics, dress material and bed hangings were exported. So India was in constant trade with Middle East, Southeast Asia, with European nations, and there was one of the very interesting quote from a Portuguese traveler who visited India, and he said that everyone from Cape of Good Hope to China, be it men or women, were clothed and dressed in the material being provided by India, the looms from India. And that was the kind of textile development at that time. During the 17th and the 18th century, it was believed that textile and spices were the key for India, and therefore India was called as a golden sparrow. Now, at that time, there was no refrigerator that was discovered. So people who used to have a non-vegetarian diet used to preserve the meat with the spices, and therefore these spices were considered very precious for the people who were utilizing the non-vegetarian diet. Again, there was a triangular trade. This concept of triangular trade was important. This existed in the Coromandel coast. Now at the Coromandel coast, what happened? Arabs brought in gold and silver. Now when they brought in gold and silver to the Coromandel coast, they exchanged it for textiles. Then they went to Malaysia, where they further exchanged it with the spices, and then they returned to the Middle East. So this was a kind of triangular trade with gold, silver, textile and spices that existed. And this was a very unique phenomena of the trade with the Indian subcontinent. Now, India had gained a reputation of being rich and extraordinary in terms of textile, in terms of spices, and used to get a huge profit. The Indian states used to derive a huge profit. Now this became well known worldwide. When Marco Polo visited India, one of the documents of Marco Polo state something very funny, rather very interesting. He said that he visited Golconda during that time, which was one of the centers for diamond mining. Now during his time in his literature, he has quoted that when it rains, the diamonds come down the mountains and people rush there to find the diamonds when it is raining on the bottom side of the mountain. Other interesting thing he quoted was eagles actually consume the food. Along with that, they consume the diamonds as well. So in the droppings of the eagle, these diamonds were found. And that the local people used to find the droppings of the eagle and take out the diamonds from there. So that was the kind of text that has been quoted. Then the next was East India Company advented into India and laid its founding stone in 1599, where later Dutch and French companies also came to India, and the idea was to re-export India's cloth to those nations. However, fixing of dyes was one of the very important techniques which was not present during that time. Now, bright colors were brought from India. This, as you can see, is one of the famous designs. This is known as Palempore. Now, this Palempore is a design which is a tree of life sign. So, you had small trees and this indicated the tree of life. Similarly, Kashmir shawls and the designs on Kashmir shawls were very, very unique for people in Europe. So, they started to imitate those designs. So, Palempore and Kashmiri shawls were the two important designs that were imitated during that time, and a revolution began in England. Now, most of the imported Indian textiles was used to decorate the beds, the furnitures, the dining tables, and these kind of things did not existed in the European market during that time. But later on, they thought of establishing factories and trades. So urban centers and coastal areas in India where you had the affluent customers, a large amount of export was made from India, and this actually was in the form of various artistic endeavors. For example, here we have one of the designs which is known as Patua. Now, this Patua design from the regions of Odisha and Bengal is a skill on woodcut and has block printing on it. Now, this has its element with Kalighat art. So this is an example of Kalighat art, and this is an example of Patua, as you can see. Now these became very unique for the people in European countries. Now the basic imperative was for India to create a substitute for that. So what they started to do was they started to create and capture the market by growing or by making quickly cheap paintings similar to the Patua paintings, similar to the Kashmiri shawls. They were on paper rather than on cloth. They used watercolor rather than the colors which were the gocha and the temperature which was used in the Patua art, and rather it was a single backdrop image as against the blank backdrops which were seen in the Patua art. Now these were some of the differences, but this became really cheap, so the common people got attracted towards it, and that coming from the foreign nation became a thing of common people's life, and they started to get actually westernized. Now similar thing happened with Kashmiri shawls. Now Kashmiri shawl was one of the mainstay of economy of Kashmir from nearly 1600 to 1860s. Till the time it was actually replaced by the imitation shawls which were built in Paisley, one of the countries in one of the cities in Scotland. Now these were imitated from the Kashmiri shawls, but had a huge difference. Now, this Kashmiri shawl was considered as a luxury item by the Mughals, by the Afghans, by the Sikhs, and by the Dak community or the Dogras. Now, Dogras actually during that time generated enormous revenue. It was believed that 500% was the profit that was generated by the Kashmiri shawls and the economy. So the Dogra rulers created a department, and this was known as a department of Dak shawl. Now this Dak shawl department had a control over the extraction of taxes at every stage. Now the duties were imposed on everything, on the pashma, on the dyeing, on every threading that was done, and ultimately 7 cents, that was the income for the craftsman. Out of that he had to spend 5 cents. So they had a very meager earning left. But despite of that, these Kashmiri shawls continued its production. This misery was also compounded by the subsidized grain, which was limited to only those who were involved in shawl weaving. So if you want a subsidized grain, you would have to weave the shawl. Now when you are weaving the shawl, of the 7 cents, you are spending 5 cents from your pocket. So you are left with only 2 of those. despite of all these miseries, there was a huge production. This production actually received a setback when this Scottish town of Paisley started creating imitation shawls similar to the Kashmiri shawls, and their production significantly increased. So it was believed that back in 1871, nearly 28 lakh rupees worth shawl was exported. But the state withdrew the department entirely, abolished this department of dark shawl that was established by the Dogra rulers, and this was a major setback to the Kashmiri shawl production. So India actually turned out from the craft producer to merely the supplier of raw material. Slowly, the Britishers wanted only raw material because they had developed a huge amount of industrialization and technology. So, craft under India was in huge pressure. In 1813, the cotton textile had high taxes from the British government. So British government actually had a free virtual entry into India. Between the period of 1814 to 1835, cotton goods that were exported from India rose from 1 million to nearly 31 million yards. So the amount of cotton that was exported out of India rose significantly. There were numerous towns which were highly dependent on textile. For example, Dhaka, Murshidabad, Surat, Madurai, and all of them actually had to go into ruin because a lot of the raw material went exported. There were new taxes which were imposed by the British government. There was a shift in the textile which left the peasants without any work, and the agriculture also became vulnerable during that time. Now again there was a drastic setback because of the American trade relations. But before 1860s, 3/4 of the raw cotton from which was in Britain was obtained from America. The British manufacturers were worried that they were highly dependent on America for the supplies, and there was a civil war that started in America. Now, because of this civil war in America, the exports which were going from America, the exports of cotton to Britain declined significantly, and Britain could not find any other good source other than India. So Lancashire, the region where you had most of the cotton centers, actually thought about winding up with Americas and switching back to India. Now, India had suitable soil, climate. The only thing was how to give Indians a benefit. So, the people were given ₹100 in advance to plant the cotton. And once they planted the cotton, the Sahukars were willing to extend the loan, and there was an increase in the cotton production in India. Nearly 90% of the imports in Britain hailed from India up till 1862. However, this again received a setback when the conditions switched. So, civil war ended, and then Britain again switched to America for its demand of the cloth or the cotton. Why? Because the fiber that they were getting from America was superior, the bales were longer, they were more stronger, and the plantation actually was of lesser cost. It was cheaper from America. Why? Because America has brought unpaid slaves, and these unpaid slaves were actually bringing in a lot to in terms of the production, but they were unpaid, so they don't had to, the people, the owners there for the plantation don't had to pay anything to the slaves. So cheaper cotton was brought, and therefore that was one of the again reasons that Indian cotton industry received a second setback during this time, and this was the worst of its time because the restrictions were imposed on peasants. The loans that were given were redebted. There were outstanding debts which were there, and the farmers, the craftsmen from India went into extreme impoverishment. On the other hand, industrial revolution boomed in England. So in 1738, Paul and Wyatt actually found the roller spinning machine and the flyer and the bobbin system, which actually created a stronger cotton thread with higher thickness. Then there was a spinning jenny in 1764 to weave the yarn at a faster rate. Manchester at that time was called as Cottonopolis because everywhere you go in Manchester, you would find a cotton industry, and that was the kind of cotton production that is started. Now this was again accentuated by the invention of cotton gin by Whitney in 1793. So these inventions actually laid the way for faster and quicker and enormous production. Now once these commodities were produced, it was like a printing press. So one after the other, cotton production started at a very fast pace, and these were again supplied to countries like India, where this fabric became cheaper than the indigenous fabrics that the Indians were producing. Initially, the traditional groups, which were the iron smiths, the copper smiths, the gold smiths, or the silver smiths, called as Kansari, Shankari, Swarnkar and Karamkar. So Swarnakar for the gold, Shankari for the copper, Kansari for the iron, and Karamkars for the silver. They actually found employment at the British printing press at Calcutta and Serampore. So at Serampore and Calcutta, in the printing press, people got employed, but here they had adopted to the old skills of using metals. Now rather than using metals, they were using engraved wooden blocks for the purpose of illustrations and printing, and this created cheap books which was into a market. So again, printing industry also faced a setback. The artisans involved or the craftsmen involved with the printing press and its concepts also really realized a huge setback during this industrial revolution. It was at that time that Mahatma Gandhi played an important role in bringing the concept of Swaraj, self-dependence, and a concept of non-violence. You might wonder how non-violence is related to it, but that we would understand in the next lecture. Stay tuned.